Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Garrett, and that's Charlie Cluis.
Hi.
We're current seniors and EI undergraduate fellows. Welcome to the second week of the Eisenhower Institute's live series. EI Live is an ongoing series of conversations featuring perspectives from our extended community to help make sense of the world around us and explore lessons from the legacy of Dwight D. Eisenhower. We'll be holding discussions every Tuesday at 4 p.m. on Facebook. And you can find any past discussions on the EI Facebook page or the YouTube channel. Today, we're going to examine President Eisenhower's parting warning against the power of the military establishment through exploring the current state of the military-industrial complex, the role of the private defense sector, and the implications for the future of the U.S. military, government, and society. We are lucky to be joined by two guests who have ample experience and knowledge in this arena. In addition to remarks from our guests, we'll be taking questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments section below. Our first guest is Dr. Chris Preble. Dr. Preble is currently the Vice President for Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. He has conducted research on U.S. foreign policy and security, American military dominance, and counterterrorism. Preble has served as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Navy. He holds a PhD from Temple University and has published articles in the New York Times, Financial Times, and Foreign Policy. Our second guest is David Tone. David Tone is the current CEO at BTS Software Solutions in Columbia, Maryland, as well as the co-founder of the BTS S2 spinoff, Verbatim. David is a retired military officer with over 24 years experience in military intelligence, strategic planning, and a deep background in cybersecurity operations, policy, and planning. Thank you both for joining us today. We're very excited to have you guys here for this discussion. And we'll start off with remarks on these topics from Dr. Preble.
Well, thank you, Sarah and Charlie and everybody for the invitation to join. I initially was invited to actually be present in Gettysburg, which is one of my favorite places, but this is the next best thing, I guess. So thanks for making this happen. And this is one of my favorite topics. I wrote my dissertation and first book on, it was called John F. Kennedy and the Missile Gap, but it was about Dwight Eisenhower and sort of the strategic debates of the late 1950s and early 1960s, and have referenced both Eisenhower's farewell address and his Chance for Peace speech from April of 1953, which I think is equally important in many respects, to this question of how the military-industrial complex, what is it, and how does it affect the way that we talk about national security threats. I actually gave a talk at Gettysburg back in 2011 on the around the time of the 50th anniversary of his farewell address, and so it's something that I've talked about often, but within the last few weeks, I've had occasion to talk about it even more because I think that in the present crisis we're in, we see how our approach to solving global problems has a sort of military tinge to it. I think that Dwight Eisenhower could have predicted that, might have predicted that. And yet we also see that military instrument, which is exceptionally capable, I've seen it firsthand. David, of course, has even more experience, far more than I do. We know what our military is capable of, but we also recognize its shortcomings. The tragic case of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, the aircraft carrier, and struggling to contain a coronavirus outbreak there, which is in some respects only slightly different from a cruise ship trying to deal with the coronavirus. So the sailors and soldiers and airmen and Marines are as vulnerable or even more vulnerable in certain respects to these kinds of threats than they are to traditional threats. And that's really where my focus has been within the last few weeks, but it also builds on some of the work that I've been doing for a number of years, which is that as capable as the U.S. military is, we have to take account of the full range of American power and influence. And I think that's what President Eisenhower was perhaps most concerned about over the course of his 8 years in office. in many respects, like I said, he gave this chance for peace speech in April of 1953. It was one of the first major speeches he gave as president. It was just within weeks of the death of Joseph Stalin, and sort of anticipating perhaps a pivot in the Cold War to something less dangerous than what the United States and the Soviet Union and frankly the whole world have been dealing with in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And one of the most famous passages from that speech is where he talks about the trade-offs between military spending and spending on domestic priorities. Everything from the cost of a bomber is how many hospitals, how many miles of highway, how many schools, how many homes, things like that. And so I wrote an article that was published last week by the website called Responsible Statecraft that sort of played that up again, sort of how many N95 masks we buy for the cost of a single M1 Abrams tank, for example, something like that. And then you go all the way to the end of his presidency and you look at the farewell address, which has gotten appropriately a lot of attention. Somewhat ironic that Dwight Eisenhower is remembered for speeches because he really wasn't a very good speaker. And all things considered, he was a little halting, and yet he is remembered for the military-industrial complex speech given just 3 days before he stepped down as president. And I think there's a tone of regret and disappointment in that speech, in that he set out with hope of trying to contain the arms race with the Soviet Union, trying to reshape and refashion American foreign policy away from military solutions to problems towards other things, and yet feeling a bit deflated by what had played out over especially in his second term. And also, and this is relevant to my dissertation, he really interpreted his Richard Nixon, his vice president's defeat to John Kennedy in the 1960 presidential election as a repudiation of his vision, of his strategic vision. And so that if I interpret and read that speech and go back and read it with those thoughts in mind, the one aspect of that speech that I don't think gets as much attention as it should, we remember the line about unwarranted influence, and we think about the political influence that he worried about in terms of military contractors and military spending and the impact it would have on at a district level or in various states. But another aspect of that speech is his concern about how military spending and the growth of government, more generally, the national security state, would pervert the academy. One of the only jobs that Dwight Eisenhower had other than in the military or as president was as president of Columbia University during a very short period in the early 1950s. And so he had just a taste of what it was like to be a president of a major university at a time when an increasing share of federal money, research money, was going to those kinds of institutions. And he worried about what it would mean for intellectual independence and creativity on the part of scholars. But he also recognized, as he said in the speech, that he couldn't imagine any alternative. The days of a solitary inventor tinkering away in his garage were likely to be gone. He never could have imagined a Jeff Bezos or a Steve Jobs, but we'll leave that for another discussion. So I think that the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about is alive and well. It exists. It does have quite a bit of influence in Washington and throughout the country, and yet, especially at this day in this present period, and in the era in which we've seen the limits of American military power and sort of trying to capture some of the other aspects of American power and influence around the world. Perhaps this might be a time when we revisit some of the money that we dedicate to the military, some of the resources, some of the talent and ingenuity that goes to perfecting the ways to fight wars, which are important, but not all that this country is about, and maybe thinking a little bit more creatively about how some of those resources might be diverted to other things. So I'll stop there, and I didn't use my full 10 minutes, but that leaves a little more time for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Preble. David, go ahead. Thank you. Sure, thank you. So first off, it's a pleasure to be here as a Gettysburg alum and there when the Eisenhower Institute started. An honor to be back on the stage, as it were, sharing some thoughts with truly impressive people like Dr. Preble. Thanks for your thoughts. I will say up front that as a career military, I couldn't be a stronger advocate of soft power, and I would agree with you that the weight of our budgetary emphasis on a military leads to the cliche if all you got is a hammer and it's the best hammer in the world and just about every problem looks like a nail, and it probably shouldn't. And you could save a lot of hammering if you were a little bit smarter with how you did your carpentry to begin with. Mm-hmm. I want to start with just a quick overview of truly the military-industrial complex, what it is now, because I would offer my thesis that we're almost in a military-industrial complex 3.0 inflection point, and we could be at the most strategic change in the military-industrial complex's influence and position in our society through much of its own fault and due to a lot of global forces. I'll start with scum-sucking, bottom-feeding, godless, soulless contractor. That's how most people in uniform look at people like myself, even though I'm retired, for providing services back into the military. The DoD, Defense Department, in fact, you can go all the way back to the Revolutionary War, looked at the industrial base as mostly a place to buy stuff. Anything from horses and saddles, going back way back when, to tanks, aircraft carriers, B-2 bombers, all the cool toys we have now, things that the DoD and the federal government can't build, so it goes to industry to build. 2.0, I would argue, started right around the end of the Cold War and the rise of, from Desert Storm all the way through to where we are now, where the military was seeking savings by bringing in contractors, the contract workforce, the industrial workforce, to provide people and services as much or more so than equipment and stuff. And the simple math was, if we hire a soldier or a sailor or a Marine or an airman, we have the cost of training them, keeping on board, keeping them in the force, and then we're responsible for paying for them, their family, their retirement, their health care, and it's a huge expense, and a similar expense level for any DoD civilians. And once they're on board, you can't rapidly and agilely change your workforce to match new needs and new requirements. So the trade-off that, particularly after the end of the Cold War, when we didn't have a large standing army, we're trying to reap peace dividends, was the industrial base said, hey, we'll provide you expertise that you can turn on or turn off relatively quickly. You'll pay more upfront on a per hour cost than you would for someone who is in uniform or wearing a DoD lanyard. But at the end of the day, you're saving money because the moment you don't need them, you cancel the contract and you've dropped that expense. And it's a way to agilely move the force around. And I certainly am not the academic to know the numbers, but I would suggest that the DoD spends as much money relatively on people and services as it does on things. Probably some exceptions like F-35s, which are insanely expensive, and aircraft carriers, which I'm told are also expensive. But we're at a 3.0 level here where the industrial complex is on its hind foot, and it's questionable whether it will recover its posit or its position and its ability to move within our defense industry. But before I do that, I want to just break apart what I see as truly the elements of the military industrial complex, and kind of breaks into 3 tiers and then a 4th tier, which is what's causing a lot of this disruption. The largest tier is what I would refer to as large systems integrators. These are massive military industrial complex businesses: Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, Booz Allen, CACI. And there's about 10 of them. You can draw a cut line plus or minus, but 10's a decent number. And these are the kinds of companies that command vast expertise, vast resources. And if you want to build an aircraft carrier, you're not doing it in my backyard, and you're probably not doing it in Chris Preble's backyard. You need someone who really knows how to build an aircraft carrier. And then, as the name implies, large system integrator, bring in all of the subsystems and then integrate them into an aircraft carrier, which is more than just something that floats. It's airplanes, anti-submarine, all the communications, life support, nuclear reactor, which is apparently a thing. And so it takes a lot of expertise that it takes decades to build up to be able to do something that complex. And that's where our LSIs sit. In the 2.0 world, they moved into the services side where they provided people as well as things. And they moved on from there. Now, the upside is they're really capable. The downside is they have massive overhead. Most of them are publicly traded, and they are traded to, to their shareholders' interests. You then have at the next level down what I would describe as a mid-tier companies. These are more focused on the LSIs, but can be 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 to 5,000 employees. And they are much like the big LSIs, but more generally speaking, more technically focused in a niche area or in a niche industry from a services perspective or technology. And then you have smalls like BTS, and I'm putting this background up just a little tongue in cheek as the scum sucking, bottom feeding, godless, soulless contractor to show where we are here. And I'll change it as we go through just to share some of the humor in it, at least humor for me. Are the smalls. So these are, anywhere from 500 per people or smaller, 26 to $50 million, depending on their skills. And there's generally three kinds of small companies. There's some that have very niche capabilities, typically high technology and AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, weapons, sensors, particularly in the intelligence field. There's some really unique capabilities that reside in companies as small as 10 or 20 people. They can provide professional services where they bring experts. BTS, we do software development, but we're also pretty heavy in intelligence operations, and we provide those professional services. So in Afghanistan, when they say they need 100 analysts, they only have 10 or 15, these are notional numbers of people in uniform, and then we provide people who are prior military, and they fill out that workforce, and we provide the agility that they need to raise or lower the capacity as the demand requires. And then the third level are suppliers. These are people who just sell stuff to the DoD, and that could be anything from servers and hardware to pulling cables to dog food, and anywhere in between. The disruptor is where we have now this entrepreneurial class, where some of the entrepreneurial class are one person, two person people in their garage. So Dr. Preble's comment, you do have the guy tinkering in the garage, in the basement. Maybe him and a buddy or her and a buddy have a really great idea, and they may or may not understand that it has defense implications. We were talking before we went live on a company that tracks your iris muscles in order to improve man-machine interface for pilot training. They had no idea that there's a defense use for that as a lie detector. And so there's a whole area there. And so what we're seeing is innovation that used to reside in these large military industrial complex companies, the LSIs, is now actually showing up in this entrepreneur space for people who couldn't even spell DoD, let alone operate in it. And so that's really causing a lot of disruption. So in this age of innovation and entrepreneurship, the DoD is struggling desperately to get out from the reality that the good ideas don't start in the defense space. They don't start with Bell Labs doing something cool or Lockheed building the U-2 or SR-71. It starts in somebody's basement. And you have an entire acquisition process that really is designed to build an aircraft carrier over 30 years, not designed to respond to the latest version of Java or what you can do with AI today versus what you couldn't do yesterday. And so DoD is trying to figure out how do they get to the innovation where it's not 10 years to write a requirement and another 10 years before the first prototype comes off an assembly line. It's already 20 years out of date. When you think about your phone, it's out of date the day you bought it, let alone 20 years from now. The LSIs are on their back foot because they don't know how to get to that innovation space. They're too big and unwieldy. Many of them are trying to buy their way into innovation by buying up these small companies, but almost exclusively, and I've seen some academic studies, 90% failure on keeping the innovative leadership in those small companies 2 years after they've been acquired. They get absorbed by the Borg. The DoD is trying hard to reform its whole acquisition process. The FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation, and the DFAR, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation, is what lays out this process designed to protect the taxpayer and ensure that the government gets what it's paying for. That leads to those 10-year requirements processes and 10 years of development. So now they're moving to things like OTAs, other transactional authorities, small business innovative research grants, broad area announcements. They've created new organizations like SoftWorks, AFWorks, Army Applications Lab, InQtel, that are trying to replicate a lot of the incubator and startup spaces that they're seeing in the private sector. But I will tell you, there's a lot of inertia and drag on these entities being able to actually acquire and bring in really cool cutting edge ideas. It's a space that we operate in, and we see a lot of frustration with small startups that are trying to do commercially relevant things that are really cutting edge, and see the DoD like, yeah, we're patriots, we want to help, we can really save lives and protect the nation, and then get hung up in a 14-month acquisition cycle. In the private sector, if you're on your third meeting with the buyer and you're not signing a contract, you've wasted your time. In DoD, if you're on your third meeting, you probably have just figured out each other's names. And so the whole system is under the recognition now that the best and brightest are not in the defense industrial base. The acquisition process is not in a place where it can respond accurately to what's happening in our commercial world in a way to keep the defense space where it needs to be. And I'll stop there because I think I've gone to my 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Tone. That touches on a lot of the questions that we have today. Our first being kind of a phenomenon that is spoken of within those four tiers you mentioned, that being the revolving door between Congress, the Pentagon, and the private sector. So you can conveniently change your background to whatever you'd like to discuss. We'll let Dr. Preble start. Our exact question is, the revolving door is a cycle that is often criticized as perpetuating the war lobby. The private sector argues that hiring military professionals is simply hiring the most knowledgeable candidates. But should these professionals then be permitted to return to government work afterward?
So that's a great question, Charlie. I think there's a real tension between wanting people with expertise and knowledge and wanting to allow them and incentivize them to leverage their expertise for the benefit of not merely themselves, but for the country. And then on the flip side, a concern about, again, the classic phrase, unwarranted influence. Are they, by the nature of their knowledge that they're carrying with them into private sector after they retire, for example, from the military, does that give them an unfair advantage or too much influence? I think that there is there's plenty of room for oversight and transparency, but I think it would be wrong to go beyond that and to place any kind of major restrictions. There are some restrictions governing how long someone has to be out of the service before they can go back into government and things like that. Mostly applies to elected officials, actually. But I think that getting back to one of David's points, is like the military industrial complex, when Eisenhower spoke of it in the late 1950s or at the time of his speech in January of 1961, it had a very particular meaning. It was companies that were bending metal to build planes and ships and tanks, and we knew what that military hardware was. I really like the way David framed it as sort of, MIC 3.0. There are technologies that we simply do not appreciate today that have military application within, who knows, a couple years, maybe even less than that. And so if you got too sort of expansive in defining away the kinds of jobs that ex-military people were allowed legally to do, then I think you're really denying the country their expertise. And so I would be concerned about sort of overreaching in the interest of trying to solve a problem, but a problem that can be solved by better oversight and transparency.
So I agree with everything that Chris said. I'll offer, there's two perspectives that I think are important. And I'll start with an anecdote. One of my best friends in the Army, amazing intelligence professional, Army officer, he was retiring a year before me, and he had a senior position lined up to work back at the National Security Agency where we both were retiring out of. And literally the day before he was going to sign, yes, I'm coming on as a senior, which is a general officer equivalent position as an SES, He ended up taking a job with BAE, which is a defense contractor, one of the smaller of the large LSIs, and was there as their expert on essentially the signals intelligence and cyber operations that Alex was an expert in. And he did 4 years there. And then he walked away and he went back in and essentially went back into the job he was going to take when he went into the Army, or when he went into BAE. And he's now in SES, working for the Army in signals intelligence and cyber operations. And what does that tell you when you talk about this revolving door? For the most part, for any sales operation, whether it's a car, windshield wipers, or aircraft carriers, or services, you have to understand what the person's problem is, what your customer's problem is, in enough detail that you can provide a viable solution that actually solves the problem. There's always an outlier, again, slimy, scum-sucking, bottom-feeding, godless, soulless contractor who's just in it for a buck and has no ethics. Those people are actually quite rare in my experience. I've met one in my whole life while I was in uniform or since being in uniform, someone that I wouldn't want to drink a beer with. Mostly it's tell me your problem so that I can craft a solution that solves your problem, because you win nothing and I win nothing. If I give you a solution that doesn't fit, you spent money, you're still frustrated, the problem's still there. We may have lost lives because of it, and mostly we've lost time. And that's the only resource that can't be replenished. So having someone coming out of the government who understands the problem to help shape and articulate the solutions in a way that actually address the problem, I think is a win-win. On the flip side, when Alex went back into the Defense Department after 4 years of being a contractor under his belt, he understood how contracting companies work. You know, what are the internal dynamics of putting a proposal together? How much does it take? You know, minor changes in schedules or changing in billing rates, or how a contract, is it firm fixed price? Is it cost plus? Is it time and material? All of these things have tremendous impact on the company's ability to sustain itself, let alone bring new ideas to the table. And they have to make money to pay the bills and hire people, and that's what makes the company go. Profit is not a dirty word. So he has been able, inside the government, to help shape the requirements and the contracting efforts so that they are protect the American taxpayer, make sure that what's being asked for is what's delivered, but do it in a way that the defense industrial base can respond to in a way that it meets a business case that causes them to want to do it. Because if there's no business case, they won't bid on it. They'll go find something else. And that problem, again, remains unsolved or solved by a less capable entity, or maybe even a less scrupulous entity. I absolutely agree. Oversight, transparency. If you have clear, inside information on specific acquisition timelines or issues or goals, you ought to be, sidelined from that, because that is unfair competition. But being able to understand the problem and help shape solutions that line up with that problem in a way that's effective, cost effective, and mission effective, I see that as in the nation's best interest. I'll offer Chris if you have thoughts on that.
No, I agree with that. I think that I don't want to add to that, because I think we basically agree that there are ways to solve this is about solving problems, that the nation has certain problems. I guess the only thing I would add, one thing, is that if you go on a car lot and you you're shopping for a car, and the salesman, you said, well, what kind of car should I get? And the salesman is going to sell you a car. He's not going to sell you a bus pass. He's not going to sell you a Metro card, right? So he has a certain set of solutions, and there's a range of solutions. It's a minivan, it's a sports car, but in his mind, it's like, how I solve a problem is to put this person in a seat, as opposed to, what I'm saying? And so I do think that in that respect, there will always be an advantage to the military contractors and people who come from the military background. Again, getting to your earlier point, you stole it. It's one of my favorite lines. When you have a really big hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think that's one of the areas where you need countervailing pressure within our government, within our system, to push against that every problem is a nail issue.
Right. But I would offer that it's more than just going in to buy a car. If you show up at the lot and say, I need to get from point A, my problem is I have to get from point A to point B and carry this much stuff. Now maybe a bus pass is the right answer, or Uber or whatever. And so what you're seeing the government trying to work with on, it's boring as hell, but defense federal acquisition regulations actually have weight. They've created these paths for other transactional activities or authorities and SBIRs where the government, instead of saying, I need a car that's this long, 4 wheels, this much, they could say, I have a problem. I need to move 12 ounces of soda from here to there. Give me your best choice. Dear private sector, tell me how best ways to move it. And I can come in with a truly innovative way of moving soda or getting them from point A to point B without having to be strictly adhering to the size of the wrench and the widgets and how many wheels and all those things that when you're building an aircraft carrier, you need to be specific so that the government isn't cheated by cost cutting.
Right.
And so it's this use of creative acquisition and creative stating your problem in a way that opens up the people who can answer to it. That's really, I think, this 3.0 innovation that hopefully we're getting to. But I will tell you that I am cynical on it. And we can get into that at another point.
Yeah, so both of you made comments regarding the topics of oversight and transparency, which can lead really well into our next question. So around half of DoD's budget is funneled into the private sector, and these private sector companies are often fined for misconduct and misusing funds, but obviously they receive contracts continuously, and often they even overspend on those contracts. So what policies do you see that will offer increased oversight, whether it's auditing, whether it's inspector general? And do you think there's real evidence in Washington that there's a push to do this?
I might defer to David on that one
Sure.
first.
So at the mechanical level, there are systems in place. So there's something called the CPARS, and if you ask me what it stands for, I couldn't tell you. It's the Contractor Performance Assessment something, but it's essentially Yelp for contractors. And after you finish a contract, your contracting officer gives you a grade and it goes in the database, and you have to have certain scores because when you're being considered with a bid for another contract, they will go look at CPARS. And so there's an incentive to do that. Cost overruns can come from a lot of different spaces. It can come from poor management, poor leadership. It could also come from poor requirements or changing requirements that the defense contracting base is trying to chase as the problem has evolved or as the government has changed its definition of the problem. Or it could be that it was really hard and they didn't know how to get there, or some combination thereof. So having insight and looking at how money is being spent and have independent oversight of it is critical. It keeps honest people honest. Again, while we hear about the dishonest ones, I will tell you from a percentage perspective, I think they're mostly very, very extreme outliers. When they hit the news, they're awful. I got it. And I'm not making any excuses for it, but they are outliers. Most of the people I work with come from a military background or government service background and have been around it, and they carry values that mean a lot to them. They may not always translate through a business model in a way that you would like, but they all believe to some degree that they're doing good for the nation and believe that their solution is the best solution. Whether that's true or not requires independent assessment, and the proof is in the pudding. In the Army's military intelligence space, we have failed twice on coming up with the new ground-based signals intelligence collector system. Spent $1 billion. We're about to spend another $1 billion, and I'm not sure what's going to come out is going to meet the problem. But I would offer it's because the entire acquisition process and requirements process is rooted in the 1970s, and the two LSIs that are chasing it and trying to come up with a solution are as much a hostage to a requirements process as they are to their own mismanagement. I don't know if that answers your question, Charlie.
Sorry, unmuting myself. Yeah, no, I think those are a great answer. If you wanted to add anything, Dr. Preble.
The only thing that I would add is Congress does have an oversight function. I'm a firm believer in sort of the auditing process and auditors within the defense procurement system. I'm a firm believer in inspectors general, but Congress has a role too. That is where spending is supposed to originate. Unfortunately, Congress can be as much the problem as the solution, but a determined, knowledgeable committee staffer or committee chairperson or a subcommittee chairperson has extraordinary capability to do investigations. And so when there's evidence of wrongdoing, they could do that. But I think for the most part, the system works reasonably well. One other thing, just say very quickly, is some of these problems that David alluded to. Some of these problems are really hard to solve, and so we should have a certain amount of empathy, frankly, for when some of these problems turn out to be really, really expensive and still not solved, but balance that with being mindful of resources and being directed or misdirected. Yeah.
Thank you. So our next question, it's going to be kind of a bit of a transition. It's more of a foreign affairs strategic question. So it's, as the global war on terror seems to have winded down, there seems to be a hope for a period of peace. I apologize, let me reword this. There seems to not be a hope for a period of peace, but rather a dive directly into what is called great power competition. Do you think this is a product of the military-industrial complex? And if not, and if it is a strategic need, can we combat these fierce threats without perpetuating such system and by potentially, as some would like, reducing military spending?
So, as the saying goes, how much time do you have? Because there are two big parts of your question, and I feel like both of them need to be dealt with. The first is the global war on terror ending? Many people in the military, even as the military, all the way up to and including the Secretary of Defense himself, have talked about the need for privileging great power competition and worried about near-peer competitors. And so that's mostly China and to a lesser extent, Russia. At the same time, the US military remains extraordinarily focused on the greater Middle East and into sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia and South Asia with respect to hunting down various terrorist organizations. And the current Secretary of Defense, Secretary Esper, refers to mowing the grass, right? This is an ongoing requirement that we will continue to hunt terrorists essentially in perpetuity. Now, I don't agree with that assessment, but that's what he says. So even in as the military itself is talking about the importance of great power competition, the GWAT doesn't, sort of grinds on. The second part of your question, though, pertains to sort of great power competition, and great power competition privileges certain types of approaches over others. In the mid to late aughts into the early teens, post 9/11, fighting terrorists is a pretty personnel intensive, ground intensive sort of endeavor. The Army grew to fight the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then came back down even to the levels that it was, or slightly below the level it was, as I recall, around 9/11. And so you have some in the Air Force and the Navy who see great power competition as being, well, now it's our turn, basically. And again, this is not to take away what the Navy and the Air Force did to fight terrorism and supporting Army operations. And I think that what gets lost in this discussion is, what does great power competition even mean? How are we going to compete? It doesn't seem like it's the kind of competition that we had with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, not least because, and again, we've learned this the hard way, not least because we live in an integrated global market, and buyers and sellers in a way that just didn't exist during the Cold War, right? As the story I like to tell, you could identify anywhere around you multiple people who have own products that are made in China, or components that are made in China, and obviously people who work for companies that do business in China, or even Chinese companies. It's not against the law for an American to work for a Chinese company. If you worked for a Russian company, for a Soviet company in the 1950s, you get a visit from the FBI, right? That wasn't done. And so we've accepted a level of integration that I think cannot and should not be unwound, right? This is a global market. And so that kind of competition is not mostly military in nature. It's about intellectual capacity, it's about ingenuity, it's about innovation. And it seems to me that those actually aren't the kinds of problems that are easily solved by aircraft carriers or F-35s or what have you. That doesn't mean that there aren't certain disputes, especially territorial disputes and things like that, that still have a clear military component. But it seems to me that the kind of competition that we're talking about is not mostly military in nature.
I agree with just about everything that Chris said. I think the original sin was when we had 9/11 is to put the DoD and the military against a terrorism problem. What is a global war on terrorism? And I was an Army planner working at the strategic level when we came up with those terms. In fact, my boss at the time he takes credit for coming up with that term working for Cheney. And I'm like, Al, what are you thinking? That's an awful. You can't have a war on a technique. And we can dive deep into that. But we ended up, the original sin was taking an entire DoD that had been optimized for finding Soviet shock armies or fighting the Chinese or fighting the Iraqis or pick a large army, what a standing military is really designed for, and pivoting it towards what we call the global war on terror. And it took a couple of years and it optimized for that. And we're very good now at finding individual bad guys and mowing the grass. And we can certainly have all sorts of conversations about whether they're the right bad guys or if they're bad enough or those kinds of things. And my position is far left than what most people would think in that context. But we took a DoD and turned it towards a problem that it's not designed for. And we're trying to unwind that, because while we were doing that, it's not a return to great power competition. It's just that we're noticing it again because we're no longer as distracted, or it's become noisy enough that we have to pay attention to it. And we're like, oh, that's right. There's the rest of the world and the Chinese and the Russians. Were not just sitting on their butts while we were focusing on hunting individual people. They were doing what you would expect any power to do, is trying to continue to improve their position relative to the world and shape conditions that they believe are optimal for their long-term strategic well-being. And that's a value neutral stance. China's going to do what's right for China. Russia's going to do what's right for Russia. We're going to do what's right for us. And sometimes there's friction points there, and a lot of friction points. I would offer that China particularly has taken us to school in understanding that the core of international power comes from your economic strength. And they have used every resource they can, to include theft of intellectual property, to degrees never before conceived, as part of building up their industrial and by extension military industrial and technical capacity to where they can challenge us when we do get into a resource friction point. South China Sea would be one, international trade is another, Philippines, all of these areas, they're extensions of this economic competition that I think they fully understand, and I think we understand as well, is the root of national power. If you want to take a look at where the U.S. stands from a global power perspective, don't look at the decline of the British Empire. Look at the decline of the Spanish Empire in the 1500s, because they faced a problem identical to what we face now. And there's a book called the Duke of the Count of Olivares, who is King Charles III's essentially national security advisor, domestic and international. And I may have gotten the title that wrong. I'll pull it up and get it to you, Chris. And he spends 20 years trying to do a rearguard action on the decline of the Spanish Empire. And every action he was facing matches where we are now. And it all went down to economic competition with the British, with other ankle biters around.
Can I just, one point on that. I think we have not, well, with one important caveat. I still think that the United States can compete in this space. I think that we have lost sight of sort of some of our economic strength that's grounded in innovation, entrepreneurship, and rewarding risk takers and things like that. And I still believe in our system as being superior to that of the Chinese system. But the other problem, and this is why I caveat, is we have a political problem in this country. And the political problem is that we are not resourcing our goals, there's this huge mismatch between what we want to achieve and what we're willing to pay for it. And that's a political problem. That's not an economic problem. So in that respect, I think there is a real vulnerability there for the United States that we need to solve. So that's to me, that's what keeps me up at night.
And just to be more clear, the gentleman I'm speaking of is Gaspar de Guzman, who was the Count Duke of Olivares. And so he worked for Philip IV. And there's a great biography of him. When you look at the Spanish Empire, where it was, they were facing two rising international maritime powers. They had the Spanish had incredible internal political conflict. They were incredibly in debt and were devaluing their currency dramatically, and were fighting two what we would call wars of terrorism or coin operations on their borders and afar, all at the same time, while trying to dig themselves out of a hole. It is an amazing parallel to where we are.
Interesting.
So we'll have one last question before the final closing remarks. And this is something that was touched on, as you kind of called it, the tinkerer in their basement. So you can either expand on that or touch on the question more directly. So it's, while the military industrial complex that Eisenhower warned of is rarely shed up in the positive light, what are any true benefits in regards to research and development, innovation, obviously just security broadly?
Can I give an immediate real world? This is an action I was doing before I got on this call and what I'm doing after. So we spent a lot of time working with startups in Boston, Austin, Silicon Valley, San Antonio, and Research Triangle. That's our space, is really connecting with startups. And when the coronavirus hit, we reached out to a small startup company that just spun out of MIT that has the ability to build essentially a Band-Aid test strip for coronavirus. And we think we can field it in about 5 weeks. And you spit on it or a drop of blood and get a test on it. That's cool and really helpful now. They've been working on this for 7 years. And we've got the DoD's interest in, okay, show us how fast you can get to a Band-Aid that we can distribute millions of them. But the fundamental piece is they can rapidly add new diseases to it in 2 weeks instead of months and months and months. And so you now have a bio health and bio protection aspect that can both the civilian community, and then as we see on the Teddy Roosevelt and the Ronald Reagan, where you have entire aircraft carriers offline. That's a staggering sentence when you have 2 aircraft carriers in the Pacific offline because of a virus. You can't understate how important that is to our posture and our ability to respond. And so here's literally 2 PhDs, 1 postdoc, and a professor who've been chugging along to help solve tuberculosis in sub-Saharan Africa, all good things. And now we're able to turn what will be a significant investment, inshallah, to help accelerate where we are and provide, hopefully, this platform to the Defense Department, and then by extension, the larger civilian community, because they'll, of course, make it available to everyone. That would not have happened, and they would not get to where we think we can get them to without the government's ability in a crisis to turn money on R&D and turn it into a product in weeks instead of years. And to Chris's point earlier on, my background's in military intelligence, and now I'm learning about assays and nano and pico receptors for proteins and reagents. Like, I know that, but we have the ability and the agility to get there. Would you box me out of that with some arbitrary restrictions on where people coming out of uniform or out of government service would or would not be able to go? Here's a case where I'm in a space I never would have known a month ago, and hopefully now we're going to have a strategic impact.
So, Charlie, let me answer your question in 2 ways. And the first is that the benefit of a military is defense and deterrence. They should go together. That to the extent that any country its security hinges on its ability to deter threats and to defeat those when those deterrent threats fail, that is the benefit. And this, again, this harkens back to President Eisenhower's speech. Is he said categorically, we never doubted the need for this new complex. We need it in a way today in 1961 that we never could have imagined even in 1861, frankly, as they were ramping up for the Civil War. But certainly at the time of the founders, they just didn't think they would need a large permanent military establishment. But he says, now we need it. But we shouldn't forget that the creation of that national military establishment to defend us comes with costs. There are trade-offs, and we just always need to be aware of those trade-offs. And so that's where I push back a little bit on the argument that heavy investment in the military generates spin-offs. It does, but we should always remember that those spin-offs are precisely that. They are ancillary to defense, ancillary to providing security for the nation. In fact, when economists study a dollar spent on the military in terms of its economic stimulus effect, it is less stimulative, less efficient than investments in civilian infrastructure or even a tax cut. Like, there are other ways to spend money. Military spending is the least efficient way to generate sort of as an economic stimulus. So that's the point that I want to emphasize, is that, again, I'm not a pacifist. I served in the military. I understand the purpose of the military, but most of the money that we spend on our military we should think of as a sort of necessary evil. It's something that we have to have to a certain extent, but we should never look at it as a thing that generates benefits that we wouldn't otherwise have, because there are trade-offs. The money that we spend on the military cannot be spent at the same time on something else. One of the things that I just came across, I knew about it a little bit. And this gets a little bit to David's point. Fort Detrick in Maryland is a bioweapons lab. That's what they were doing in the Cold War. And now Fort Detrick is on the front line, quite literally, of trying to deal with the COVID outbreak in terms of vaccination and immunization, things like that. So that's a clear case of a utility, or military in nature. It was, they had a very clear military purpose, which has a civilian spinoff. And yet that is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction even of the Army's budget, let alone the entire military establishment. So while we can identify examples of beneficial spinoffs that apply to the civilian, entirely independent of the military, for the most part, we should look upon military spending as security in nature and not as an economic benefit.
I would violently agree with everything Chris just said. We spend a ton of money on it. We do get some security on it. Could we get more security if we put a small percentage of that in the State Department, USAID, and other aspects of soft power? I would argue 7 days to Sunday, absolutely. I don't know if this is true, but if it isn't, it ought to be. The operating budget of an aircraft carrier battle group is a single one is equivalent to the State Department's budget. If it's not true, it's probably not that
Pretty
far
close.
off.
Yeah.
Right? That's wrong. That's wrong. I've worked in the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad for a year and a half, working with the interagency process, trying to help, get the Iraqi government back on its feet after we cut the knees out from under them. And tell you what, security only takes so far. You need a strong whole of government approach that we have starved, in my opinion, to the benefit of the DoD, says the defense contractor.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good statistic. I know I heard the other day, I guess, in regarding not money, but more members of Army bands than there are, like, bands as in musical bands, than there are entire diplomats in the entire world. So it stretches pretty far. But thank you both for joining us today. It was great. We really appreciate it.
Sure, my pleasure.
My pleasure as well. Thank you for the work.
This was really great.
Yeah. Thank you again to both of our speakers and to Charlie for fielding questions. I'd just like to remind everyone that we are having another discussion next week. It'll be a discussion between Susan Eisenhower and George Beebe of the Center for the National Interest on the current state of geopolitics. And that'll be streamed on Facebook Live again at 4 o'clock. So we'd love to have everyone tune in for that. But thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you have a good evening.